In the late 18th century, a young woman was born among the Khoikhoi people in South Africa. She had no way of knowing that her body, her very existence, would one day be used as a spectacle for the world. Sarah was trafficked to Europe under false promises, paraded on stages like an animal, and subjected to the cruelty of racial and sexual exploitation. Even after death, her suffering continued. Her remains displayed in a museum, her dignity stripped away for centuries. This is her truth, a heartbreaking story. Sarah Baartman was born around 1779 in the Gamtoos Valley of South Africa, part of the indigenous Khoikhoi people. Life for her community was already under siege. European colonists, first the Dutch, then the British, had seized lands, enslaved her people, and imposed their rule. As a young woman, she worked on a colonial farm, where she was likely exposed to European settlers. It was there that she caught the attention of Hendrik Cesars, a Dutch farmer who saw more than just a servant. He saw a financial opportunity. Partnering with William Dunlop, a British ship surgeon, Cesars promised Sarah a new life in London. They assured her she would find wealth and fame, that her beauty and uniqueness would be celebrated. But when she boarded the ship bound for England in 1810, she was walking into a nightmare. When Sarah arrived in London, she was placed on display like a circus attraction. Advertised as the Hottentot Venus, she was paraded in Piccadilly Circus, where people paid to stare at her curvaceous body, particularly the steatopygia, or large accumulation of fat in her buttocks, a feature common among Khoikhoi women. The spectacle was deeply degrading. She was dressed in tight, revealing clothing meant to exaggerate her features. Some visitors were allowed to touch her, for an extra fee. Outraged by her treatment, British abolitionists took action. In 1810, the case of Sarah Baartman was brought before a London court, arguing that she was being held against her will. But under coercion and likely fearing for her life, Sarah testified that she was performing willingly. With that, the court ruled in favor of her captors, sealing her fate. By 1814, she was sold to an even crueler master, a Frenchman named Hendrik Rowe, who took her to Paris. In Paris, Sarah's treatment worsened. Rowe was an animal trainer, and to him, Sarah was nothing more than another creature to be displayed. She was forced to perform at elite parties for Europe's wealthiest men and women. Some laughed, others gawked. But there was an even darker aspect to her exploitation. She was trafficked for sexual entertainment. Wealthy patrons paid for the chance to touch her, humiliate her, and violate her dignity. As her physical and mental health declined, she turned to alcohol, possibly to endure the relentless abuse. Within 2 years, in December 1815, Sarah Baartman succumbed to illness, alone, in a foreign land that had never seen her as human. But even in death, she was not free. Sarah's body was handed over to Georges Cuvier, a leading French scientist. Obsessed with racial classification, Cuvier dissected Sarah, preserving her brain, genitals, and skeleton. He used her as evidence to support racist theories that black people were biologically inferior. For over 150 years, her remains were displayed in the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. It was not until 1974 that her remains were removed from public display. But still, they remained locked away in a French archive, far from her homeland. It would take another 28 years before justice would finally be served. In the late 20th century, activists across Africa demanded the return of Sarah Baartman's remains. Among them was Nelson Mandela, who personally urged France to repatriate her. At last, in 2002, France relented. Sarah's remains were brought home to South Africa, where she was given the burial she had been denied for nearly 2 centuries. She was laid to rest in Hankey, Eastern Cape, near her birthplace. A nation mourned her suffering and honored her legacy. But her story is more than history. It is a warning. Sarah Baartman's fate was not unique. Her story symbolizes the countless black women who have been objectified, dehumanized, and erased by colonialism and white supremacy. Today, her name stands as a reminder that human dignity must never be a spectacle, and that no one should be reduced to the object of another's gaze. Sarah Baartman's life was filled with suffering, but in her death, she became something greater, a symbol of resistance, dignity, and justice. She was a woman, not a spectacle, a human being, not a curiosity. Her story may have ended in tragedy, but today, the world remembers her not for how she was seen, but for who she truly was.